Hello everyone and welcome to the grand finale of British and American culture. We started this class 14 weeks ago, and for those of you who are still watching and paying attention and doing well in your assignments, congratulations. I think it's one of the more difficult classes to take in that we offer in the English Literature and Language Department. One of the reasons for that is just because the size of the material, the size of the scope of the class. And a lot of students have emailed me this semester and said, what's the scope of the exam? What's the scope of the quiz? It's large in most cases. It's covering chapters and centuries and countries and sometimes the entire world. And I think everyone's done very well keeping up. I'm trying to introduce you to as much as I can. There's a limit to how many things I can talk about, but I think hopefully you've got a solid basis for understanding British, especially British, but now as we do the last few weeks of this class, hopefully you're getting a sense of what America is like too. Now, America is a very forward-looking country. That's the way it's been since it was created. Unlike a lot of countries that usually look backward. Cultures tend to have golden ages, and they tend to think that that's when their culture was strongest, that they were most powerful, and that the people that lived during that period were the best that their country ever produced. Now, I think this is not true. I often ask Koreans, when is the best time to ever live in Korea? Chosun, Goryeo, Shilla, Three Kingdoms, Goguryeo, Gojoseon. When was the best time? During Imjin? None of those answers sound very appealing. When King Sejong was king, there was enough problems during his reign that you wouldn't want to live then either. Probably, except for the current coronavirus situation, the 21st century is the best time to ever be a Korean person. Now, you can disagree with me if you want. If you want to be a hero and you want to fight on a Kabuk-san and defeat the Japanese, but most people wouldn't consider that fun. The average Korean person has a better quality of life now than they ever did before. But this is the reason I'm saying this is because this is what it's like in the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom looks back to the 19th century and, to a certain extent to Elizabeth in the 16th century and Shakespeare, and looks at that as the golden age of British culture, of English culture. The Scottish Enlightenment, right? Pre-United Kingdom for some Scottish people, when they successfully defended their country against the invasion of, Edward. King Edward and his son King Edward II, and William Wallace and Robert the Bruce saved their nation. All of those times were great and impressive and were meaningful to the culture, but that wasn't really the best time for a person to live. It's great to watch a movie about Braveheart, but it's not so great to be one of those people running into sharpened stakes and being cut in half with axes and swords. So the reality is that although the Victorian Age and Charles Dickens and the Gilded Age in the United States and World War II was a sort of climax of American achievement, it's still, almost by every metric, better to live in both of these cultures today. So we've been talking, let's get back on topic, because I am going to do one more lecture later this week. It's going to be an exam review. If I get to it today, I will, but probably it's going to be later this week. But I want to focus on wrapping up, the chapter that we're on, chapter 7, and looking at American culture in connecting it to our contemporary experience. So all of you are young, younger than me, and so you've grown up being familiar with American culture because since World War II especially, the United States, because of its superpower status, has had a cultural and economic and military influence on the entire world. As the leaders of capitalism and what they refer to as the free world, a lot of a lot of information and a lot of policy and development has revolved around the United States. Now, there's a rebalancing going on right now, which is natural, just as there was a rebalancing, in the late 19th century and early 20th century when it shifted towards the United States away from Europe. Now it's shifting towards Asia, and there's going to be more cultural shifts in the near future. Africa is developing, and as the African population and the African nations progress and develop, and their cultures become more well known, you're going to see another rebalancing. No one can say what that rebalancing is going to look like, but we can look at the cultural, evolutions that we've watched in these two great cultures, and make some judgments on what might happen to us in the near future. Most predictions relate to China and India and Africa becoming more important. And I think that's inevitable with so much of the world's resources and people being in those areas, that they will continue to be more important in the cultures of the world. Now, to go back to America, one of the things that we haven't really talked about too much is artistic elements of culture. And usually when I have this discussion at the beginning of the class, when I introduce the class, the course to the class, many students, when I say, what is culture? Or give me some examples of culture. Clothing and manners and weather and products and art are common examples. Some food, right? What do you think? Give me an example of American culture. A cheeseburger, okay? Give me an example of British culture. Fish and chips, okay? Now these are just common foods that, have become iconic, and they're fairly reasonably priced. So it's not the best American food or the best British food by far. It's just a common food that people generally eat when they don't want to spend too much, and it's Friday. Fish and chips is generally eaten on Friday, traditionally. So common things. I mean, fast food is sort of part of an American business model where they wanted cheap, convenient, available food that could be mass produced and sold to everyone in the country. And McDonald's is the largest fast food restaurant in the world. Subway and Burger King, KFC, all of these are American companies that have developed on following McDonald's model. But I think the best thing, we don't have time to talk about food and art and everything else. So what I'm going to focus on is what I have in the textbook, which is about American cinema. And there's several reasons for this. One is because American art and sculpture and British art and sculpture and food never really reached the height of, say, France, Spain, Italy, Russia, Germany. They never developed their, it's different now. Cuisine is, fusion, and there's many people who have come to America and brought amazing food. If you go to London, the best food in London is, Indian curry and Jamaican jerk chicken and Japanese sushi. Like the variety of food you can eat in London is amazing. So don't get stuck eating pub food and French fries and fish and chips, because you have the whole world. You have experts from countries all over the world that can. I had a Turkish breakfast when I was in London. It was fantastic. It was healthy. It was delicious. And I've never been to Turkey, so I can't compare. But if that's what people in Turkey eat for breakfast, I want to move there. So this is the kind of thing. It's a cosmopolitan place. The United Kingdom is a very multicultural, cosmopolitan culture. You can be exposed to all kinds of different things from around the world. It is, when the British Empire existed, it kind of expanded outwards and kind of sucked in people from all over the empire, willingly and not, as we talked about. Some of these people were taken not of their choice, or some of them moved there because the opportunities in their own country were very few compared to what they could do in the United Kingdom. So there's a lot of people who used to be part of the Commonwealth or the British Empire in the United Kingdom. So if you go there, you'll be surprised. London especially is very, very multicultural. You can't tell who is British and who's not just by looking at them, by how they dress or the color of their skin or their hairstyle. It's very, 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 very cosmopolitan, and I think it's great. It's a symbol of a globalized international city, and that's a positive thing. Now, when you get back over to Americans, as I said, it's the biggest, most multicultural country in the world. Canada is bigger in terms of size. So is Russia. China is about the same size. But basically, in terms of proportions of people of different religions and ethnicities and geographic backgrounds and cultural backgrounds, the United States is by far the most multicultural country in the world. Smaller countries might, have similar ratios, but the United States has 325 million people, and they have millions of people from 100 different countries. This melting pot, as they call it, and it's a misleading term, melting pot, because people don't completely melt and become one thing. They become a multicultural thing. In a melting pot, everything melts and becomes one thing. But the problem with American culture and identity, the thing that we've struggled with even more than with the British culture and identity is, what is an American anyway, right? I look American. People run around all the time calling me Migugin here. That's the first thing they say. They don't guess I'm Canadian. No one does. Some people do, but it's a lucky guess. I look like a typical American. Well, so is there a difference between Canadian, culture and American? Absolutely. Don't ask me that question. I don't want to, go off on a tangent, but there is. It's not as deep and as fractious or as important to a Canadian as like a Chinese person or a Korean being mistaken for a Japanese. There's not as much tension there, but we care that we aren't them, and they care that they aren't us. How can you distinguish something being American? Well, one of the best things I ever heard was one of my favorite podcasters described the United States culture as the two-headed giant, right? And it's got one body, but it's got two heads, and those two heads are always in opposition to each other. So when they do something, it's like they go to war, but they protest as well, right? It's these dichotomies of American culture. They have the best healthcare in the world, but only a few people only a certain portion of them have access to it, right? You could see this in the pandemic. See this, how many people died in the United States? 600,000? Most of those people were not wealthy. A disproportionate number of these people were poor and had less access to healthcare. They were racial minorities and they had less money. It affected poor people much. It was much more severe amongst the counties, the states, and the neighborhoods that had minorities in them and had less wealth. As you saw, Donald Trump got it. He was in the hospital for a few days. He had one of the top doctors in the world checking him. They gave him some oxygen, gave him some medicine, and he's walking around, even though he's 75 years old, he's walking around like he just had a cold and went to the pharmacy. Not everyone is that lucky. So this is the problem. And one of the problems one of the places you can see this playing out in American culture is in its entertainment industry. And over time, certain parts of the entertainment industry have improved, but some of them have not. So again, we don't have time to talk about music and acting and sports, but these are the three, I would say, giants of the entertainment industry. In Korea, I would say, the music industry in Korea has grown faster than its movies but Korean dramas are famous too. You've got these three things, right? You've got your sports leagues though. Americans love their sports. America has a very deep and old and cultural investment in its sports industry. That's why Korean talented Koreans like Liu Hyunjin go and play in the MLB, even though they're playing in Toronto, but it's part of the American system. That's why they go and play there, because there's just so much money and so much exposure, and there's so much opportunity to play sports in America that they pull in athletes from all over the world, because they want to play in the biggest arenas. They want to make the most money. They want to compete against the best in the world, and that's where they can do it. Hollywood has become this too, and 4 out of the top 5 sports leagues in the world are in America. The largest movie industry by far is in the United States. It's Hollywood. It wasn't always like that though. The French, especially the French, in early cinema were the leaders, and French cinema is still considered critically, to be excellent. Although it's not as dominant in terms of size and influence and dollars, it is. There's the Cannes Festival, the international competitions still, have some sort of, connection to the French cinema. But in terms of just size, influence, production, economic technology and economic size, the dollars and cents, Hollywood is the biggest movie industry in the world. The Chinese movie industry is also starting to grow. India has Bollywood. Korea has a pretty healthy, and really interesting movie scene as well. Parasite won the Oscar and everything. So, it's balancing out. But if you look at the 20th century and how dominant America becomes politically, militarily, and economically, the sort of development of Hollywood parallels that. And it also has some of the nativism and conservatism that I talked about that kind of started to come back at the end of the 20th century, and that now we're still dealing with. That there's still some part of American culture that's resisting this free-flowing, multicultural, liberal society that sometimes it looks like it is. There's a core of American conservative, nativist, and sometimes racist culture that kind of pins down American culture, and that these two things are always at odds with each other, right? And it causes a lot of anxiety and uncertainty, and it causes a lot of fighting politically and literally between American people. It's a very diverse country with very wide ranges of opinions, and so you can go to one state, you can go to California, and then you can go to Mississippi, and then you can go to New York, and you can go to Texas, and then you can go to Alaska, and the cultures there are just completely disconnected from each other, it seems like. If you go to Gyeongsang and you go to Jeolla, you're going to see some differences, but it's mostly antagonism between those two groups. But that's not really what the difference between Alaska and California is. They don't really care about each other. They don't have any rivalry. California is, 400 times bigger in terms of population and makes way more money. There's nothing very similar about their climate or anything. But they are both American and they identify as American, even though they're completely different. One's in the Arctic and the other one's on the beach. Okay? So California has actually a very, very strong influence on Hollywood because there were different American studios. Florida also tried to compete for, developing the movie industry, but basically California became dominant, and all of the more successful, economically sound, financially successful studios sort of started to relocate or develop in Hollywood, and it kind of just caused the other potential places. There were several, Florida being one, and there was one in the Northeast as well, where they tried to start the studio business, but just the concentration of development in California basically caused the other areas to wither and disappear. And part of the reason is because there's rapid improvement of technology and resources and participation. So let's talk about this, because this is really going to be the bookend to our class this semester. So we've talked about the American century, the three eras with the two crises in between. This is the way we're going to divide the Hollywood eras, because this is the way they divide them, in the encyclopedia, and famous professors and researchers have decided. So I will follow their model that the American cinema can be divided into four major periods. The first one is really easy to remember because it's called the black and white era, and that's because the films are in black and white, there's no color, but also it's silent. So at the beginning of the black and white era, you've got no sound either. Just, cut scenes with like words going, "Oh no," and "Help me." It's like, "Where are you?" And they have to like throw up the words in between the scenes, to show everybody what's being said. And everybody's just lip syncing. It's almost unwatchable. Anyway, that's the silent film era. No sound. Then they add sound, but it's still black and white. So then you got basically from the World War I time, from the early 20th century right up until the Depression, you've got gradually improving the technology from no sound to black and white to more clear, more detailed black and white, and then you have color films coming in in the 1930s. Late 1930s, Wizard of Oz comes out, where they go from black and white to Technicolor when the house lands, and Snow White is the first fully animated film, which is all in color, which Disney releases, and that marks the end of the black and white era. So then you get into the classical Hollywood era, which includes the Golden Age. So once you get color and you get actors who are talented, even in the black and white, it doesn't have to be color yet. There's at the end of the black and white era, there are actors who are starting to become famous for their ability, and star power increases. And as they move into the classical Hollywood era, it's these actors, these famous stars that people want to see. And so you start to see more movies being done by certain famous actresses and actors, because that's who they want to see, right? So we're very used to this. It's like, well, I love Robert Downey Jr., so is there a movie out that's Robert Downey Jr.'s star in it? I don't care what it is. Like, I don't care if it's Iron Man or Dr. Dolittle or an action film or a drama. I just want to see a film with him in it because I love him, right? That's the kind of attitude that started to grow. And this meant that the studios had to pay the actors more, and that the actors could, publicize. They became celebrities, and they could publicize their movies, and they could draw audiences to their movies. Now, this created a golden age of both interest in the stars and also, in the late Depression and World War II, movies was the thing to do. Like, that was the activity. It was the height of the studio system. So everybody watched movies. Like, every weekend, that's what you would do. You'd go see a movie. And you go on a date or go with your family. But everybody was watching movies. Part of the reason was the television wasn't invented yet. So when the television is invented, there's a bit of a lag until it starts being produced, and then lots of people start getting them. But over the 1940s into the 1950s, televisions become more and more common. And at first, there's like, if you have a television, it's black and white, and there's nothing to watch. You know, it's not like nowadays where it's 24 hours a day, television, or the internet. It's like there's something on from 8 o'clock in the morning until, dinner time, and then the programming stops. There's no late night stuff. There's nothing in the middle of the night. You can just watch, there's only a few channels. So it doesn't really pull the audiences right away. But as they start adding programs, television starts expanding and having different types of shows on it. There's game shows and there's news. People start focusing more on their television, and then you can just stay with your family and relax. And you don't have to go to the studio to watch something. You can just be a couch potato and watch the TV. So, the numbers decline. And then they kind of, slowly reduce until the current day. And honestly, the interesting thing is the internet and, video cassettes being available and, being able to record movies in your own house if you wanted to, hasn't really caused, people still want to go to the movie theater to do something as a social activity. People still want to go and see movies and see it on the big screen with big sound, and enjoy, the social activity with their friends and family. So, in the last, since I was born, since home videos started to be released, there hasn't been a significant decrease, in movie going. We still have cinemas; they didn't disappear, but the number of people who went to see movies peaked around 1940. And people were, if you ask the average person, they would say, yeah, I go to see a movie once a week or once every 2 weeks. These days, the average person sees a movie once a month or once every 2 months. It's completely different. So that's what classical Hollywood is. Star power, lots of people going to see the movies. Television comes in there towards the, end of the classical Hollywood period, and that ends the golden age of studios and movies. And then we get into the next era, the third era, which is called New Hollywood. It's kind of confusing because it's not the newest, it's the third. At the time it was called New Hollywood, but we never changed the name. So New Hollywood kind of starts in the mid-1960s when the types of movies start to change. The classical Hollywood period had a lot of dramas. There was cowboy movies. And now in the 1960s, the director tends to be more important. They're getting, more artistic style movies. The genres are expanding. You can see science fiction type movies and horror movies and fantasy movies and things. It's starting to branch out, and the director's creativity and style has a lot to, offer in the 60s and 70s. And then after that, about 20-year period of director, exploration of different genres, and the strong influence of the director becomes more important. Then we get into our current era, which you can argue, again, it's kind of changed again. I would say there's probably, it's time to add on one new section. And I'm going to do that myself. I'm going to split it into two, because otherwise you go from about 1980 until 2021, which is 40 years. And for nothing significant to change, that doesn't make sense. But anyway, I'm going to say this is called contemporary Hollywood, okay? The last 40 years, since I was born in 1981. Star Wars was in 1977. That was a watershed. That was an extremely important moment in the development of the technology of movies. And for most people, Star Wars blew their mind. Like seeing spaceships, even though the lasers looked like crayons and the spaceships looked like cardboard, that experience, that science fiction space experience was incredibly impressive. And Star Wars has really ridden on the back of that stardom and impressive moment of revealing what the real potential of science fiction technology is, until now. You know, it's been 45 years and people are still going, those original Star Wars movies were so good. And there's other reasons for that too, but the main thing was it was like a breakthrough. It was a scientific breakthrough. And we've gone through, you know, through the 80s and 90s, there was a lot of action, adventure, and science fiction movies that were made. And then we got to the point at the end of the 1990s where Star Wars was just a brand. And I remember distinctly going to watch Star Wars because they did the prequels. They went back and made these 3 new movies and they were garbage. The technology was amazing, but the movies were horrible. But even with the technology, it was just a whole bunch of sort of CGI characters. They just made these big scenes with a whole bunch of robots shooting each other. It wasn't very intimate. And it was just like a bunch of big scenes that you're watching, and it wasn't really enjoyable. It wasn't they didn't do a very good job of creating any of it. The story, the acting, everything seemed to be out of touch. Anyway, don't get me started on that. But the main point is, at the same time, there was a movie called The Matrix that was released. And in The Matrix, they did all these really cool CGI and camera things. They had a camera well that spun around 360, and they had this thing called bullet time, where, you know, they shot the bullets and slowly everything went into slow motion and they rotated around the scene. And it was a revolutionary approach to a science fiction action movie. It wasn't really about the content, it was just about how it was filmed and how it was frozen, so you could see everything from all angles, and then it would you know, burst back into reality and go into full speed again. I think that's one of the moments where CGI started, you know, to push the technology to a different level. So there's a difference between 1980s, beginning of contemporary Hollywood, where there's special effects, explosions, you know, models being hung on strings and move around and manipulating lights and stuff like that. There's a difference between that and CGI, computer, you know, generated imaging, computer graphics, where you're generating entire backgrounds and realities. Like Avatar was another one of those movies that I didn't really like the movie, but it was just amazing to see an entirely computer generated world that looked like it could be real, even though it's obviously an alien, you know, fantastic creation in somebody's head. It looked like you were actually there. It was that's what CGI did. So you got special effects. The thing that defines contemporary Hollywood is special effects. And around the late 1990s, around the year 2000, we get a huge special effects upgrade in the form of CGI. And I would argue, you know, in a way, we're in the 5th period now, the CGI Hollywood era. And Marvel, you know, obviously Marvel Studios and Disney ended up taking over that. Okay? There's a few little things there that you need to read about the Hollywood blockbuster and how CGI's being, you know, manipulated or being used primarily to entertain us. And after that, there's a little bit of a series about the presidents. There's a list of presidents there. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to just stop there for today. And when I do my review later this week, I'm going to cover these presidents that are at the end of the chapter, and then we're going to stop. So don't worry about chapter 8. I'm going to just discuss about the important presidents of the last, you know, 100 years or so. And then I'm going to go over, you know, major things that you need to remember to study for the final exam. And like I said I believe I wrote on it hasn't been uploaded to the Cyber Campus yet, but it will. And on my website, on the Cyber Campus, it's going to tell you whether you're writing in room 124 or in 456 or 465. I think it's 465. It's either 124 or 465. And I'm going to make a list there. So I guess I'm dyslexic today. I've written down 456, but I'll double check about that. There's 2 possible rooms. Most of you, 45 students, will be writing in 124, and the remaining 20 students will be writing upstairs on the 4th floor. So you'll have to check the spreadsheet and make sure you go to the right room, but everybody's writing at the same time. It's going to be a 10 o'clock Friday morning, June 11th. Okay? I will slowly get through all of your assignments, but probably they won't be ready until after the exam. If you have any questions or concerns, as always, just send me an email. But otherwise, I'll see you in the exam. Study hard. And I will upload one more lecture this week so you can have a look at what you need to review, what I recommend you review for the exam. Okay, thank you very much for listening. Have a great week.